How do you raise 102 stories of steel in just over a year? With no computers, no modern cranes, nothing resembling today's technology. In 1930, the answer was a machine most people have never heard of. A mast and cable rig called a guy Derrick, hauling loads remembered as 50 tons, climbing the frame as fast as the building rose. 9 of them at once, 4.5 stories a week. The speed was extraordinary, so was the danger. The same derricks that raised the Empire State Building also put men directly beneath tons of swinging steel, and the story of how it all came together starts with a race no one could afford to lose. Steel and ambition rose together over Manhattan in 1930, even as the city's fortunes fell. The Wall Street crash had left banks shuttered and breadlines growing. Yet on the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, surveyors marked out the footprint of a building that promised to outdo every rival. At street level, the Empire State Project looked almost reckless. An office tower planned for more than 100 floors, launched just months after the country's economy collapsed. But to its backers, this was more than a business gamble. Former New York Governor Alfred E. Smith, fresh from his bruising presidential defeat, and financier John J. Raskob, the General Motors executive with a taste for spectacle, became the public faces of the project. Their names filled newspaper columns. Their speeches promised jobs and hope. Smith called the tower a monument to the city's faith in itself, while Raskob brushed off rumors of secret loans and boasted of private capital ready to build higher than anyone dared. Skyline was already a battleground. The Chrysler Building, with its stainless steel spire, had just claimed the world's tallest title at 1,046 feet. 40 Wall Street, a sleek newcomer in the financial district, briefly held the record before Chrysler's hidden needle rose overnight. Each new floor inched the headlines upward. Engineers and architects traded barbs in the press, and every rivet seemed to carry the weight of civic pride. Empire State promised a leap past them all. 1,250 feet to the roof, a mooring mast for airships, and a construction pace that would leave competitors scrambling to catch up. For a city battered by uncertainty, the tower became a symbol of stubborn confidence. Crowds gathered to watch the steel skeleton rise, while newspapers tracked progress floor by floor. In the depths of the Depression, the race into the sky was more than a contest of height. It was a public drama, a wager on the future, and a daily reminder that New York was still willing to build when others hesitated. Steel alone could not lift itself skyward. At the heart of the Empire State Building's rapid ascent stood a machine that looked almost simple, the guy Derrick. Unlike the tower cranes that would later dominate city skylines, a guy Derrick relied on tension, not mass. Its mast rose straight up, anchored in place by a web of steel cables, called guy wires, stretched tight and fixed to the building's growing frame. These cables held the mast steady, even as it reached dozens of stories above the street, allowing it to stay upright without a heavy base or sprawling supports. Swinging from the mast was the boom, a long arm pivoted at the base. The boom could be raised or lowered and swung in a wide arc, giving the derrick reach across the deck. At the base, a winch powered by steam or electricity reeled in thick hoisting lines. This simple combination, mast, boom, guy wires, and winch, formed a compact lifting engine capable of raising steel columns and girders weighing many tons. What set the guy Derrick apart was its adaptability. Where a modern tower crane is anchored to the ground or bolted to the building as it rises, the guy Derrick could be unbolted, moved up, and reassembled on the next floor, always staying close to the work. Its footprint was small enough to fit onto the narrow ledges and platforms of a crowded Manhattan site, a critical advantage when every square foot was claimed by trucks, scaffolds, and the endless parade of materials. The stability of the derrick depended entirely on the tension in its cables. If the guy wires sagged or shifted, the mast could buckle under the weight of a steel beam. But when properly rigged, The system was both strong and nimble. Crews could swing a beam out over the city, position it with precision, and then, once the floor was finished, hoist the derrick itself upward to begin again. This was not brute force, but a balance of forces, a dance of tension and control. It was the perfect machine for a project that demanded speed, flexibility, and ingenuity, all while working within the tightest of urban footprints. Steelwork on the Empire State Building moved with a rhythm that few outside the trade could fathom. The secret was not just in the power of the guy derricks, but in how they moved. Instead of anchoring a crane to the ground and letting the building climb away from it, the construction team kept their lifting machines close to the action. As each floor of steel was finished, the derrick itself was taken apart, hoisted up, and rebuilt on the new level. The process was swift. Riggers and ironworkers worked in practiced teams, unbolting the mast, gathering the guy wires, and then reassembling the whole mechanism on the fresh steel deck above. This leapfrog approach created a kind of mechanical relay. The derrick didn't just serve one spot. It followed the crew up the building, always within reach of the next load. As soon as one derrick finished its work on a floor, another would be waiting to take over, sometimes with as many as 9 derricks operating at different heights across the site. Each completed level became a new launching pad, turning the rising skeleton into a climbing machine in its own right. The logic was simple but elegant. By keeping lifting power near the top, the crew avoided the delays and hazards of hauling beams from street level through a maze of scaffolds and half-built floors. The steel never had to wait. As soon as a beam arrived, it could be hoisted straight to where it was needed, swung into place, and riveted down. The site itself seemed to be in constant motion, derricks rising, booms swinging, iron workers balancing on narrow flanges as the city dropped away beneath them. This system demanded precision and trust. Every move had to be coordinated, every cable tensioned just so. A misstep could mean a jammed lift, or worse, a toppled mast. But when it worked, the effect was almost seamless. The building grew upward not in fits and starts, but in a steady, almost industrial climb. The relay of derricks transformed the Empire State Site from a static job into a living, climbing mechanism, one where human skill and mechanical ingenuity worked in lockstep, propelling the tower higher at a pace that left the competition far below. Steel for the Empire State Building did not arrive in manageable pieces. The beams and columns that formed its skeleton were some of the largest ever lifted in a city setting. Massive sections, sometimes stretching over 60 feet, each weighing as much as a city bus. The job of moving these giants fell to a relay of 9 derricks, each one braced by taut guy wires and anchored to the rising frame. At any given moment, these derricks worked in concert, swinging their booms high above the street, hoisting columns that could tip the scales at 30 tons or more. The public came to know the figure by a simple shorthand: 50 tons. Whether or not every lift reached that mark, the number captured the brute scale of the operation, the sense that with every hoist, the machinery was brushing up against the limits of what steel and cable could bear. The real force of the derrick system was not just its lifting power, but the way it multiplied risk. Every ton of steel in the air became a test of the entire system, of the mast, the guy wires, the winch, and the men guiding the load. A single miscalculation could send a beam swinging wildly or bring the whole rig crashing down. The speed of the build only raised the stakes. With the city watching and the schedule unrelenting, the derricks worked almost without pause, sometimes completing a full floor's worth of lifts in a single day. The rhythm was relentless: load, hoist, swing, set, repeat. There was no margin for error. Accounts from the period described the ground trembling as a 30-ton column left the pavement, the cables humming with tension, the boom creaking as it reached out to the edge of its arc. Workers learned to read the subtle warnings, a shift in the guy wires, a groan in the mast that signaled when the system was nearing its limit. The danger was not hidden. It was part of the daily calculation, present in every decision to raise a load, every shouted warning across the deck. The Empire State's ascent was powered by machinery at the edge of its capacity and by men who trusted their lives to its strength, again and again. The ground beneath the Empire State Building was never meant to hold mountains of steel waiting for their moment. In the heart of Manhattan, space was measured in inches, not acres. There was no storage yard, no buffer zone for idle beams. Every delivery had to be calculated, every shipment tied precisely to the pace of erection above. Steel left the mills in Pennsylvania and arrived in New York as part of a tightly choreographed sequence, each batch ordered to match the progress of the derricks and the crews they served. The system depended on ordering just enough steel for a single lift or, at most, 2 floors at a time. This lean approach left little room for error. If a shipment was delayed, the entire rhythm of the build could falter. Iron workers might stand idle, the derrick silent, while a missing beam sat miles away on a stalled freight car or a barge held up by fog. On schedule, though, the process ran like clockwork. Beams arrived, were tagged, and hoisted skyward in a matter of hours, not days. The site's efficiency was built on this razor-thin margin. There was no stockpile to cushion a mistake. Each piece of steel was part of a moving assembly line, from furnace to frame, with the pace set by the relentless upward climb. The derricks provided the muscle, but the timing, the steady flow of material, matched to the exact needs of the crew, was what kept the project alive. In this industrial ballet, organization mattered as much as raw power. The Empire State Building rose not just on steel and sweat, but on the discipline of a supply chain that could not afford to miss a beat. Every piece of steel that entered the Empire State Building site carried its own instructions. Each beam was stamped with a code, a simple set of letters and numbers, but enough to tell the foreman exactly where it belonged. One beam might read D4217, another C5312. This was not just for record keeping. The code linked the beam to a specific floor, a precise location, and even the derrick that would lift it. When a truck arrived from the Ambridge plant in Pennsylvania, the crew did not waste time sorting through a pile of steel. They already knew which beams would go up next, which derrick would handle the lift, and where each piece would be set in the rising frame. This discipline turned the chaos of a Manhattan construction site into something close to a vertical factory. Instead of pausing to puzzle over blueprints or hunt for missing parts, the iron workers moved in a steady sequence. Beams arrived in the order they were needed, tagged for their destination, and hoisted within hours of leaving the truck. If a floor called for 3 columns and 6 girders, those exact pieces appeared at curbside, ready for the next lift. The result was a rhythm that echoed the assembly lines of Detroit. One operation flowed into the next with little room for delay or confusion. Progress was measured not in guesses but in stories climbed, about 4.5 each week. On paper, it looked almost mechanical. In practice, it depended on the discipline of the crews, the accuracy of the codes, and a supply chain that worked with near-clockwork precision. The coded beam system made it possible for the Empire State Building to rise with a speed and certainty that set it apart from anything built before. A steel beam destined for the Empire State Building began its journey far from Manhattan's grid. In the rolling hills outside Pittsburgh, molten iron poured from the furnaces of the Carey Works, churning out thousands of tons each day. At the Ambridge plant, about 16 miles downriver, that iron was rolled and pressed into the I-beams that would soon become the bones of a skyscraper. Each piece was measured, cut, and stenciled with a code. Its destination mapped out before it ever left Pennsylvania. Once cooled, the beam joined a waiting convoy at the river's edge. Barges lined up along the Ohio and Monongahela, loaded with steel bound for New York. The trip eastward was a race against the clock. The construction schedule demanded that steel arrive not in weeks, but in hours. From the rolling mill to the river, from the river to the docks, every handoff was timed to keep the flow unbroken. After the river journey, the beam reached the port of New York. Here, cranes and dock workers moved it from barge to truck. Manhattan's streets, already crowded with traffic and the noise of the Depression, became the final gauntlet. Trucks threaded their way to Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, arriving just as the derricks above finished the previous floor. There was no room for error, no storage yard, no backup plan if a shipment stalled. From the moment the beam left the furnace to the instant it was lifted skyward, the entire journey could take about 80 hours. The beam's arrival was not a matter of luck, but of a regional network working in tight sequence. At the site, the coated steel was matched to its place in the frame, hooked to a waiting derrick, and hoisted into the air. In less than 4 days, raw ore had become part of the city's tallest ambition. The Empire State Building's rise depended not only on muscle and machinery, but on a supply chain as disciplined and relentless as the crews working above the street. High above Manhattan's grid, the iron workers earned their nickname, Sky Boys, not through bravado but through daily routine. Their world was a lattice of steel beams, some no wider than a man's shoe, swept by wind and city noise. These were not faceless laborers. Each brought a practiced sense of balance, a memory for every rivet and seam, and a quiet trust in the men beside him. Their skill was as much physical as mental, reading the sway of a girder, knowing when a cable was too tight or a bolt not quite true, moving in step with the rhythm of the derricks and the shouts of the foreman. Safety harnesses were rare, almost unknown. Instead, the Sky Boys relied on muscle memory and instinct, gripping a 2-inch flange with boots worn smooth by weeks on the steel. The work demanded absolute focus. A misstep could mean a slip, a fall, or a beam drifting off course. Yet for many, the danger was simply part of the job, a risk offset by the steady pay and the pride of building something that would outlast them all. Camaraderie ran deep on the high decks. Crews formed tight bonds, built on shared risk and long hours. Men watched out for each other, passing tools hand to hand, calling out warnings above the clang of dropping rivets. Oral histories from the time recall a sense of brotherhood, a feeling of being part of a team that moved as one body, each man's safety tied to the actions of his neighbor. Lewis Hine, hired by the Empire State Corporation in 1930, turned his camera on these men. His photographs, taken from a suspended basket or perched on the beams themselves, captured the reality of the work. A riveter crouched with his back to the void, a welder's face lit by the arc, a group of men sharing lunch with their legs dangling hundreds of feet above the street. Hine's images brought the public face to face with the human side of skyscraper construction. They showed not only the scale of the project, but the courage and concentration required to keep it moving skyward. Decades later, these photographs remain some of the most enduring records of what it meant to be a sky boy, ordinary men at extraordinary heights, building a city's future with every step. Danger on the Empire State Building site did not stop at the edge of a steel beam. Even workers far from the open air faced risks that were woven into the job itself. Below the guy derricks, the atmosphere was tense and unpredictable. Steel beams, sometimes weighing more than 30 tons, hovered overhead as they were swung into place. Every lift filled the air with the hum of strained cables and the clatter of metal against metal. A misplaced shout or a moment's distraction could mean a load drifting out of line, a cable snapping taut, or a hook slipping loose. The machinery that made the building rise so quickly also magnified the hazards for anyone working beneath its reach. The space directly below the derricks became a zone of constant threat. Iron workers and laborers on lower floors had to watch not only their footing, but also the sky above. Tools slipped from hands or pockets, wrenches and bolts tumbling from the heights could pick up deadly speed before striking the deck below. Even a dropped rivet, small as it was, could inflict serious injury. The boom of a derrick swinging a column across the frame traced a wide arc that crossed paths with men moving beams, laying decking, or guiding loads into position. Coordination was essential, but no amount of planning could eliminate every risk. Weather added another layer of uncertainty. Rain slicked the steel, turning footpaths into traps and making every step a calculation. In cold months, frost and ice made the beams treacherous, while summer storms could send gusts whipping through the open frame, rattling cables and shaking the entire structure. Workers learned to read the sky as carefully as the blueprints, knowing that a sudden downpour or a shift in the wind could turn routine lifting into a scramble for safety. There were days when the job ground to a halt, not because of equipment failure, but because the weather made it too dangerous to continue. Danger. The order imposed by the relay system did not erase danger, it only managed it. Schedules were tight, and the pressure to keep the steel moving never let up. Men below the derricks worked in a world of shadows and noise, always aware that the next lift could bring an unexpected hazard. The careful choreography of the site, signals between riggers, shouted warnings, routines drilled into every shift, was a defense against chaos, not a guarantee of safety. Mistakes could still happen in an instant. The system that allowed the Empire State to climb so quickly demanded constant vigilance from everyone on the site, from the men perched on the highest beams to those working in the shadow of the machinery above. In this environment, danger was not just a matter of height. It was built into the very process that made the building possible. The official record of the Empire State Building's construction is matter-of-fact and unembellished. 5 men lost their lives while the tower rose over Manhattan. Each death is documented in municipal archives and company logs, leaving little room for speculation. The causes were as varied as the dangers present on the site. One worker fell from a scaffold, a reminder that even the simplest platform could turn fatal in a moment. Another was struck by a truck, caught in the constant movement of materials and machinery at ground level. A third lost his footing and fell down an elevator shaft, a hazard faced by those navigating the unfinished core of the building. The fourth was killed by a swinging hoist, the very machinery that made the rapid pace possible. The fifth died in an explosive blast, a risk that came with the controlled use of dynamite during excavation and foundation work. These incidents did not cluster around a single task or location. Instead, they reflect the range of threats faced by workers on a site where steel, concrete, and heavy equipment moved in close quarters. The tally of 5 is not an estimate or a myth. It is a historical fact, drawn from coroners' reports and death certificates filed between 1930 and 1931. For a project that employed thousands in an era before modern safety standards, the number stands out not for its drama, but for its restraint. Each name on the list carries its own story, but together they form the official record of loss during the Empire State's ascent. The deaths are not a talking point, nor a legend to be inflated, but a somber part of the building's legacy. Sensational headlines once claimed that the Empire State Building claimed far more lives than the records support. Early reports in the New York Daily News and other papers put the death toll at 14, and in some retellings, the number climbed even higher. These stories took on a life of their own, repeated in books, documentaries, and casual conversation until the myth seemed to overshadow the facts. Yet when researchers combed through municipal death certificates, coroners' inquests, and the company's own accident logs, they found no evidence to back up the inflated numbers. The official tally, drawn from concrete sources, remains at 5. No missing certificates, no clusters of unreported deaths, No hidden tragedies buried in the paperwork. Each fatality on the site was documented, investigated, and entered into the city's archive. The gap between rumor and record is striking. The myth of mass casualties has proven stubborn, surviving in public memory long after the details faded. It is a case study in how the drama of skyscraper construction, the spectacle of men working at impossible heights, and the appetite for shocking headlines can combine to rewrite history in the popular imagination. Why did these rumors persist? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the work itself. The sight of ironworkers balanced on narrow beams, swinging heavy steel above the city, invited stories of danger and loss. The pace of the build, the rivalry with other towers, and the sheer scale of the machinery all fed a narrative that seemed almost too dramatic for the facts. In the end, the legend of the Empire State Building's death toll became as much a product of the era's anxieties and ambitions as the building itself. The real story, one of risk, discipline, and a remarkably low official count, remains in the archives, waiting for those willing to look past the myth. Discipline shaped every level of the Empire State Building's construction. From the first beam to the last rivet, Starrett Brothers and Eakin ran the site with a rigor that set them apart from their rivals. Every morning began with foremen reviewing lift plans and walking the decks, outlining the day's hazards and assigning roles. No task started without a clear chain of command. The workers themselves were not just skilled, they were selected for their experience with high-rise steel. Many had already built upward on other towers, bringing with them a practiced sense of balance and a memory for how danger can unfold in a heartbeat. Safety nets became a signature of the project. Stretched beneath the work platforms, these nets caught slips that would have been fatal on other sites. While they did not eliminate risk, they turned a fall from a death sentence into a bruising lesson. The presence of nets was more than a precaution. It was a signal that management took safety seriously, even when regulations were minimal and harnesses almost unheard of. Communication on the decks was standardized and strict. Crews used a system of hand signals for every hoist and swing, ensuring that a rigger's silent gesture could stop a load or direct a boom across the frame. Shouted warnings were drilled into routine, and the clang of steel was often punctuated by a foreman's call. These habits minimized confusion, especially when 9 derricks worked in tandem, each with its own team and rhythm. Miscommunication could mean disaster. Discipline made the difference between a close call and a catastrophe. The relay system itself, dangerous by nature, became more predictable through this organization. With each derrick leapfrogging up the building, the risks multiplied, but so did the opportunities for control. The crews knew exactly where each load would land, which beam was next, and how the sequence would unfold. This predictability allowed for planning that went beyond luck or bravado. Every lift, every step, was part of a larger choreography. While the machinery was immense and the dangers real, it was this coordinated approach, rooted in experience, clear signals, and the discipline of daily routines that kept the toll lower than anyone expected. The Empire State Building's safety record was not a product of chance. It was the result of management and workers treating risk as a problem to be solved, not a fate to be accepted. Today, skyscrapers rise with digital precision, but the Empire State Building's ascent remains unmatched for its raw combination of muscle and method. The Guy Derrick's legacy endures, reminding us that every modern skyline rests on both calculated risk and the lives of those willing to face it. As cities build higher, the human cost behind the steel demands our memory and our respect. What would we risk today for such ambition? Share your thoughts below.